Legend of Total War here, and today I'm going to be doing another Total War critique. I really appreciated everyone that participated in the discussion on the previous one. It was very positive. You know, not everyone agreed with me, but everyone focused on the subject at hand, which was really good. There was minimal intellectual dishonesty. The conversation made its way over to the Reddit, but they didn't just copy-paste my link, didn't go, but Legend said this. They instead wrote it out in their own words, and everyone focused on the subject rather than the person who brought it up, which was exactly what I wanted to see. But obviously there was some criticism to be had in that video. It had a very long intro, and that was where majority of the criticism went to. So for those of you who don't want to sit through another long intro, just scroll down to the comment section. You'll find a pinned comment there that'll send you to 4, 5, 6 minutes into the video. I don't know, because it's not scripted. And skip the intro, just go straight to the beginning of the critique. Okay, so for those of you who remain, just want to say how much I appreciate the fact that you'll listen to these intros. I think that the disclaimer made a huge difference in terms of the discourse. I guess it's the first time really that I've made a video like this that hasn't devolved into an absolute shitfest, and so it was absolutely necessary to do that. However, I think I've made my point. I don't need to do it again, and the timestamp that I put in the comment section is largely for my own sick enjoyment, because what I've done is I've sent people with low attention span forward, and they're going to miss the beginning of the critique, and then they're going to skip their way straight back here and end up wasting more time than those of you who stayed here. This is for my own sick enjoyment. I'm probably going to get a lot of shit for it, but I kind of feel like, sometimes I just got to troll people. You know how it is. It's harmless fun, but it's fine. Anyway, let's get into the actual critique itself. Wow, how about that? Minute 40, we're already done with the intro. Quickest intro ever. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Endgame Crisis for Total War in general, but mainly focusing on Warhammer 3. The angle that I'm going to come at this from is not that this is a critical issue, as in, the game is not shit if they don't improve this system, because at the end of the day, if you don't like the way that the Endgame Crisis currently works, you can just turn them off. It is an optional mechanic. However, it would seem, based on what I've seen, that most people leave it on, largely due to forgetting about it, and it's not a system that you can turn off once your campaign is started. So if you set everything to default, and you're at turn 100, and then suddenly the endgame crisis triggers, and you're like, oh, damn it, I forgot to turn it off, that's a bit of a problem. So there's a number of issues, I think, with the endgame crisis, specifically in Warhammer 3, that I think are massive missed opportunities. Like I said, not critical issues. I think that this system here that's currently presented has a lot of customization, and that some people really enjoy it, and that's great. But again, based on what I've seen, a lot of people don't like it. And this, I don't think, is a player trap specifically, unless, you know, it's a player trap to just forget to enable it, or disable it, I guess. I guess you consider that, because it is enabled by default. But yeah, I think that a lot of people actually don't enjoy this, and I'll explain why. I get a lot of save files sent in from you guys. The majority of the videos I make are disaster battles or disaster campaigns, and I get sent in a lot of save files. And a lot of those save files, almost every single day, I get sent in one that is the first turn of somebody's endgame crisis. And these are campaigns that are otherwise in really good shape. They've got like 50 to 100 settlements, they've got really good armies, and then their endgame crisis triggers, and then their first reaction is, oh man, I'm going to send to Legend. And I think it's largely due to them just not wanting to deal with it, because they forgot to turn it off. Because they could absolutely beat it. It's just a matter of time. Because we have to keep in mind that not everybody has an unlimited amount of time to play this game, and that the game should do its best to try to respect the player's time. And Total War in general is not good at doing that. Now, I think a lot of people that play Total War Warhammer specifically have a lot of free time and don't mind ridiculous amounts of grind, and so this doesn't bother them. But I largely think that the endgame crisis system, specifically in Warhammer 3, is not a matter of challenge, but a matter of grind. Basically, it just adds extra busy work, extra repetitive activity that you've already done just for the sake of it. And that's fine if you enjoy that kind of thing. But I think that was like the easiest implementation they could have done, and also the least effective. So what I would like to see is for them to update some of this stuff, to make it more engaging for a wider variety of people in the community, and maybe even have an mid-campaign option to turn off endgame crisis if the player actually forgot about turning it off at the beginning of it. I think that would be quite good, especially considering that even on legendary difficulty, you can change the battle difficulty straight to easy and basically cheat your way through anything. I guess that's one way you could argue to deal with the endgame crisis, is just turn the battle difficulty down to easy, because yeah, that makes the auto resolve super powerful for the player. Now, what I'm going to do is go through each of these endgame crises, explain what happens with them, where I think the strengths and faults of them are, and the interesting and the uninteresting parts of it. Again, the main thing that I think is a problem here is grind. And what grind, it just adds more time to people playing it without actually adding more gameplay. So an example of that is like, if you're fighting against the exact same enemy army over and over again, this is kind of grind. It's like repetitive action. If you're fighting on the same battle map over and over again, it causes battle fatigue. And so the way around that is to add variety of maps, variety of enemies that you go up against, which in Total War Warhammer is usually pretty good. Not so much with battle maps, but in terms of the variety of enemies that you will face. They've done a good job with that, especially compared to other Total War games. But again, with these, what it does is just spawns a shitload of armies, gives them a bunch of cheats, but the armies that you'll be facing are no different to what you would have otherwise faced in terms of their unit compositions if they weren't an in-game crisis. They just get some cheats and they get some for free. That's really it. It's the laziest way to go about it. So let's first go through these here. So the Black Pyramid, this one causes a bunch of armies to show up, depending on your in-game difficulty setting. It's basically how much grind do you like? Do you like minimal grind, or do you like to grind for days? It's up to you. Around the Black Pyramid of Nagash. Now, the faction that has the in-game crisis depends on which Tomb King faction last owned the Black Pyramid of Nagash. It's usually the Sentinels, but sometimes it can be Cetra, and I guess it's potentially possible for any of the other ones if they at some point owned it, which the player could ensure that, by selling it to them. I think that's what happens with it, but this is not a setting that I turn on very often, so I don't really experiment with it exactly, but that seems to be what happens. So basically you just have to defeat all the armies, wipe out the faction. It's a pretty basic endgame crisis system there with the Black Pyramid. Grudge Too Far is definitely the most grindy of them. This causes the most amount of endgame crisis factions. So every major faction of dwarfs becomes an endgame crisis, of which there are currently 6 major factions, and every single minor dwarf faction also becomes an endgame crisis. And a faction that was removed from the game comes back and becomes an endgame crisis, and they're actually at the same. There's actually two dwarf and endgame crisis start in the exact same location. That really goes to show you how forgotten this system is, and how much CA just shoehorned it into the game and then forgot about it, because they added some changes to the dwarfs and didn't make it any changes to the actual endgame crisis. Okay, then we've got the biggest war. Now this one here you could argue as having the least amount of grind, because you can kind of defeat the biggest war before it even emerges. In all of the other cases, if a faction that would eventually become an endgame crisis is defeated before the endgame crisis, they just come back. They come back in their capital location. But when it comes to the biggest war, the greenskin factions don't come back. At least that was the case last time I played it. They may have changed it, but again, they don't really touch on the stuff very often. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. So for example, let's just say the endgame crisis is going to trigger on turn 100, and you take out Wurzag, Grom the Paunch, and Skarsnik, but Azag and Grimgor are still around. Well, those are only 2 endgame crises that you'll have to deal with. The other ones won't come back. So you can kind of defeat this before it even starts. However, I have heard, but I've never seen it, that if you defeat all of the factions before the endgame crisis triggers, that there'll be like a minor endgame crisis that'll appear at the Black Crag. But I've never seen that actually happen. So that one there has the least amount of grind. Then we've got the Wild Hunt, which functionally works exactly the same as the Grudge Too Far. It's just that there are way fewer Wood Elf factions than there are Dwarf factions. And there is also more isolated sort of concentration of Wood Elves, specifically in Athel Loren, or even within the Empire, you could argue, compared to the Dwarfs, which are spread out everywhere except for the New World and like Lustria and stuff. But they're more spread out, so they spread out a lot quicker. These ones here, there's only 4. Sorry, it's 4 major factions, and then I think there's 4 minor factions that show up as well. because there's the Bowmen of Orion, and then there's the Laurelorn Forest, but the one in Cathay, they don't become an in-game crisis. I'm fairly sure about that. I do think this one here is annoying to deal with, but that's just because Wood Elves in general are annoying to fight. That's all. Then there's Vampiric Ascension. So only the major vampire factions come back, and none of the minor ones become a endgame crisis. So pretty straightforward with that one. Then there's Vermintide. This one's a bit interesting, just a little bit, in that it has two phases. There's like the sort of half beginning phase of it, where it has a few endgame crisis armies spawn, but you can still kind of negotiate with them. Unless, of course, you have that enabled, in which case you'll be able to talk to them even after they become full endgame crisis. But anyway, 10 turns after that, they'll have their full endgame crisis trigger. And if the faction had previously been wiped out, it will come back. Also, a whole bunch of undercities will be spread out across the world. One factor with this, though, is if you're playing with Reichland, you'll get like a quest battle to fight, which will give you some, basically the Ubersreich 5 or 4, whatever, to help deal with the Vermintide. Obviously, they do present themselves as the garrison at Ubersreich as well, but you'll actually have them running around the campaign map if you do that. Then there's the Will of Hashut. This is the only one that I would consider to be even like kind of well designed. Because this one here is an actual different scenario that gives you actual objectives and something of a reward for finishing it. In that it's not even one of the major Chaos Dwarf factions that becomes an endgame crisis. It's that one minor one that confederates Tsar Nagrand and then becomes the endgame crisis. And they teleport their armies to wherever the end result of those drills are. But all you have to do to take out this endgame crisis is send your armies through the drill, which will send you into the Darklands, and then take out the Tsar Nagrand province, and that ends the endgame crisis. And the drills remain, and that's kind of your reward for beating them, is that you can use these essential fast teleport spots. So basically just sea lanes. I don't think it's a fantastic reward, but it's the only one that really offers you anything whatsoever for doing it. And it does give you a different scenario, as opposed to, here's 40 armies that, I'm exaggerating there, here's 8 armies that spawn. They're all exactly the same. Have fun fighting the same armies over and over again for the next 10 hours. Yay, grind! So I think that one there is the most interesting. And on that note there, I would like them to take this concept and basically go further with it, but with all of these, and make them all a unique scenario, and actually give something to play out, something for having done them. You know, maybe even if each of these has something unique, there's actually some reason that some people might go ultimate crisis mode, apart from, yay, I have 100,000 hours free because I don't have anything else to do and I don't own any other games. I'm just going to play this one campaign for the rest of the year, because that adds so much grind. Anyway, what I want to do here is I want to load up this particular campaign here that I started earlier today. Nothing special about the campaign, but I'm just going to basically show you an existing endgame crisis as of its turn 1, and sort of talk about what some of these issues are and what we could do, maybe, or what can be done for some solutions. And I imagine a lot of this stuff here can be done with mods. I don't check mods, I just would like the base game to sort of not have to always rely on mods to make terrible systems better. That would be great. Okay, so this one here, I enabled the Dwarf endgame crisis as early as possible, and this is on the default settings. So it's 100 strength. So minor factions will spawn 2 armies, 2 of these sort of Doomstack armies. Major factions will spawn 4. And if you have a look over here, there are many, many dwarf factions that will emerge if they hadn't already been wiped out. Thing is here, with Karak Norn as an example, Karak Norn actually didn't get wiped out. So this is the turn of them spawning. So they haven't had a chance yet to launch an attack. So even though their capital is here, their original capital was Karak Norn, and that's where they're going to spawn. Now, the thing that I mentioned earlier about 2 endgame crises starting in the same location is Krakadrak. Krakadrak doesn't start off in the campaign anymore. In fact, I don't think there's any way to actually bring them back apart from an endgame crisis. Now, because the Masters of Innovation have that as their endgame crisis location as well, there's a weird thing that actually occurs where these guys will end up going to war with each other immediately. So it's so clear that they just freaking forgot that this faction even exists in the game files and forgot to just copy them or just cut them out of it. It just goes to show you, they don't pay attention to the stuff when they update the game. It's just completely forgotten. Now, these armies here, there's no units that you wouldn't otherwise encounter. So it's not like there's units that the dwarves have hidden that would only ever show up if they're an endgame crisis. So there's no new gameplay shown up by this. You're not going to encounter anything new. It's just more of the same. They have all of their tech finished, because it's only turn 21. There's no way the AI would, under normal circumstances, get their stats up this high. You know, they don't have any bonuses from the Lord, because they haven't had a chance to put the points into those guys yet. So all of these are just from the technologies. They also get more campaign cheats as well. So even after these armies here have been eliminated, because they have a self-sufficient, reduces their upkeep cost by 100%. Even after these armies here have been eliminated, they'll still be tougher than what they otherwise would have been, just because the added cheats on top of it. Now, this is my solution for making this more interesting. Basically, in most games, not all, if you want a player to... Well, like a general sort of gameplay loop, it goes as follows. Set player a task. Player completes the task. Reward player for doing the task. Rinse and repeat. Then set them another task. And what Total War does sometimes is sets player a task, player completes task, and then it sets player a task again without rewarding them. Now, this was something that was a critical fail for them with the Realms of Chaos campaign. I tried to explain this to them, but it fell on deaf ears. And this is something that they do quite a lot, is that they'll set up systems. I wouldn't call this one here a player trap. They set up systems that don't adequately reward the player for the amount of time that they spend on it. Because you don't have to reward the player, don't get me wrong. Some people just enjoy the journey. But it helps to incentivize people to do these tasks if there is something additional at the end of the tunnel. Like, think of I use this as an example sometimes. Think of Skyrim. Imagine doing a quest, and you complete that quest, and you get nothing but the thanks and adoration of the character that you did it for, right? You don't get any gold. You don't get like a unique item that you otherwise couldn't get. You don't get any unique spells. You just get, thanks bro, you won that mission. That would feel, especially if it took you 10 hours to do it, like a bit of a waste of time. I feel like that's the same thing in what is essentially an adventure strategy game, where not only are you looking to conquer the map, but you're also going on an adventure in most of your campaigns. You know, you've got your lords, and each of them have got their quest lines to deal with, and then this is an optional mechanic that you don't have to turn on, and it has absolutely no adventure to it. It just adds grind. And this is the case of pretty much every single Total War. And the thing is, you could do so many little things with it that would improve this situation by a vast amount, that would incentivize people to actually do these endgame crisis without fundamentally breaking the game. Like, if somebody is able to take out the endgame crisis, then they can finish the game, right? This is the highest challenge usually of any campaign. Usually, not always. Because some of these endgame crises can be trivials in some settings. But there's a lot you could do to make it more interesting by providing the player with a reward that really is like not difficult to implement, that they couldn't otherwise get except by defeating an endgame crisis. So one example of that, and this is something that they're adding more into the game, just not in this aspect of it, is items. So for example, let's just say you beat the dwarf endgame crisis since it's here. What if there was a unique item that you could only obtain? Some sort of like unique weapon that's, you know, hidden within the vaults of the Karazhan Core. Like this is an example, the original Phoenix Crown, just as an example, right? So there was an item that you could only obtain by defeating the endgame crisis, and it doesn't have to be totally game breaking, but it should have some sort of active ability attached to it. That way, you could only get it if you do the endgame crisis, and it should be unique to each of the endgame crisis. And if you do all of the endgame crises, then each of those rewards should be put on the table. Now, that's just one example. You can do the other way of just like adding a static bonus at the end of the campaign. So, for example, the Vortex campaign in Warhammer 2, you complete that, and then you just get these huge faction-wide benefits. You know, plus 14 Lord Recruit rank, 50 extra wins of magical armies, all that kind of stuff. So, I wouldn't go that far with the endgame crisis for this, but make them somewhat thematic. So, you defeat the dwarfs, well, plus 100% trade resources produced at all regions. You know, something like that. Doesn't change anything, gives you a reason to do it, and make each one different. So make it relative to who they are. So, you beat the Greenskins, for example, maybe plus 10% physical resistance faction wide. You know, that'd be great for Tehenowin, who already gets an additional 10% on top of that. So, you know, again, just something different. That's why they add these extra items into these games, to give you something to go explore and go and do, to experience the world that they have created. They've got a setting in the game that doesn't provide any gameplay or any additional gameplay, because you can go up against the dwarfs. You can easily go up against Karaz-Karak, and they can build this army there on their own. This just adds more time to go up against them. And maybe you just really enjoy fighting dwarfs, and that's fine. If it suits your need, like I said, not everyone is going to agree with me on this. Some people think the endgame crisis is going to be fine as it is. Like I said, non-critical issue. But I do get sent in a lot of save files from people that are on the turn 1 of their endgame crisis, and they just give up immediately due to campaign fatigue. That's basically where the player isn't defeated on the campaign, their just will to continue is depleted. And Total War could do a lot more to reduce that amount of grind and keep people engaged longer. If there is a light at the end of the tunnel, you're more incentivized to finish the tunnel if there is something in the end of it. Like with the carrot and stick approach. It would be great if after getting the stick, you got a carrot. And that's all that the endgame crisis is. It's just stick and no carrot. And when it comes to games in general, unless it's a game that is specifically designed to make you suffer, which I don't think Total War is, it should have a carrot. And again, this is something that I brought up a lot with the Realms of Chaos campaign. A bit of a moot point now, because who the fuck plays Realms of Chaos? Well, one of its biggest fails, and I tried so hard to explain this to CA, but it just fell on deaf ears, is that you go through this narrative campaign that is quite painful to go through with its fucking rifts and stuff, and at the end of it, the reward is so insubstantial and so cookie cutter, because everyone just got the same thing. And their solution to that was to just add either Be'lakor as a generic lord, like it just wasn't very interesting in that setting, or you get a bunch of cheats which it directly copy pasted out of the Vortex campaign. Like they're identical. It's just Warhammer 2 cheats. They literally couldn't come up with unique completion scenarios for each of the base lords for the game. All of the end narrative, it's just narrative with no actual gameplay implications. So I thought it was just a complete wasted effort. And, you know, Realms of Chaos completely fell off. It just wasn't popular at all. Probably not exactly for that reason, but I think that was a contributing factor. And I think that's one of the things that causes endgame crises in Total War Warhammer 3 to not be widely enjoyed by those who play this game. And I think that they could make it wider enjoyed if they just... I don't even think the suggestions that I suggested were difficult to implement. Like, when you create a new item, you don't even need to make any new graphics. Because, like, for example, let's take the Helm of Dreyska. That is like a database entry. That's all it is. It's not even... There's no new visuals whatsoever. That weapon, or that helmet doesn't show up visually changing any character. So making how many in-game quests are there? Like 8? Making 8 new items will take them like 10 minutes, you know, apart from thinking out what those items should have. So it's really simple solutions. But that would definitely incentivize me to actually enable these endgame crises just to get new items. Because getting new items and doing quests and stuff is fun in this game. And that's why when you do a fucking quest battle in this game, it gives you a damn item. Imagine doing these quest battles and then it goes, you won the battle, and then nothing else. You don't, like, at least when you do a quest battle, you get loot money as well. Like, when you finish an endgame crisis, it literally fucking gives you nothing. It goes, well, guess what? Your reward for beating the endgame crisis is not having to fight the endgame crisis anymore. Well, guess what? You didn't have to fight it in the fucking first place because you didn't have to enable it. I know I'm riling myself up here. Just understand, it's just for entertainment's sake. I'm not really pissed off about this, because in my own personal campaigns, I just don't turn on the endgame crisis. So this doesn't really bother me that much. I just would like to see it, that's all, because there are examples in other games, and I'm going to use Stellaris as an example here, that have endgame crises that are really engaging. So if you haven't played Stellaris, highly recommend that game. I haven't played it in a long time myself. but I've clocked up about 1,000 hours in it. And the way that it implements an endgame crisis, you're not going to be able to copy paste that exactly into Total War Warhammer. But basically, how it works is that there's various different endgame crises, not that many, like four or five, I'm not sure, different endgame crises. And they're triggered by different things occurring throughout the campaign. So, for example, the Praetorian Swarm, I'm sure I mispronounced that, invaders from another galaxy. They are different from the AI one that can show up, like the synthetic revolt. So basically, if there's too many synthetic beings in the galaxy, they can basically overpower and become an endgame crisis. So if you've got synths within your empire, that can be basically just turn on you. And then there's like from another dimension, like if your race is particularly psychic, they can inadvertently open up a rift to another dimension, have these ethereal beings come in and cause huge problems. Unique scenarios. But the thing is, each of these scenarios is tackled differently, and the rewards for beating them are substantial. Basically, the game acknowledges that you did something difficult, and it rewards you for doing so. And you can only get those rewards by having done the endgame crisis, or by cheating, which I don't even know why I bring that up. Some people do say, but you just get them with cheat codes. It's not rewarding to do that. Well, at least for most people, I think. But the point is that when Endgame Crisis in Stellaris shows up, it adds new gameplay to it, because you can't encounter that gameplay unless you enable that Endgame Crisis. And the reward, it gives you a reward for actually doing it, allowing you to finish the rest of your campaign with a bit more ease, having a bit more of a advantage, given the fact that you've gone through that challenge. And the thing is with those endgame crises as well, is that they usually don't start off as like, oh look, 400,000 army just showed up in the middle of nowhere and is destroying everything. They usually start off relatively small and become super powerful very quickly. And so the players involved need to get on top of that very quickly, or else it snowballs out of control, like faster than you can outpace them. Like they get to a point, critical mass, where you probably won't be able to stop them if you leave them for too long, unless you're really good at the game. But that doesn't happen with Total War, because it's the opposite. They show up, they're literally right now as strong as they're ever going to get. And they only get weaker. Because if we take the example here of Karazakarak, actually no, I'll use a different example. I once set a Ultimate Endgame Crisis and just hit end turn loads and loads of times and just see what happened. And after about, I don't know, 50 to 100 turns of the Endgame Crisis, this was Ultimate Endgame Crisis, by the way, Grimgor was the biggest. He got to about 100 settlements and then just couldn't get any further. So he took about 1/5 of the map, and then that was it. He couldn't get any further, no matter how many turns passed, wasn't able to expand any further. And the thing is, in Warhammer 2, factions that were not endgame crises were able to conquer more territory just organically throughout the campaign. So I thought it was a really wasted opportunity. Now, using some other Total War games as examples with endgame crisis, not every single one of them has an endgame crisis, but let's just go back to some of them and where they fall flat as well. So Medieval 2 has an endgame crisis, and that is the Mongol invasion, and then also the Timurid invasion. Both of those are shit. It does offer some gameplay that you otherwise wouldn't get, because you go up against the Mongols, which have different kind of units that are just basically super tough, really. It's not like you can't encounter horse archers. Well, at least with the Timurids, they show up with elephants, which they don't show up until the Timurids arrive. But yeah, you go up against factions that you otherwise can't go up against. But it's a little bit different because it's historical, I guess, because you kind of expect it to some degree. But yeah, it just shows up spam armies and loads of cheats. Not a very interesting way of going about it, but I'm not really sure how else they would go about something like that. Way to beat them is just kill off all their characters, which can be a challenge for some people. Then another game that's got an in-game crisis, Shogun 2 with the Realm Divide. I think that for the most case, the Realm Divide triggers a little bit too early. So you can derail a campaign by just getting bullied by the AI if you just trigger it too early. So the way to handle that endgame crisis, if you're not particularly good at the game, is simply just delay triggering the Realm Divide, and then it gets easier the later that you do it, which in my opinion should be the reverse. I think it should be more difficult the later you leave it. So basically encouraging the player to get the fucking move on and cause the Realm Divide as early as possible. Not necessarily the case in Fall of the Samurai. I'm talking about the base game. I don't know if Three Kingdoms has an in-game crisis. personally. Never really played the campaign long enough for that one. Total War Attila has an endgame crisis, which is the Huns. It's a terrible endgame crisis because the way of beating that is counterintuitive. I've beaten this over a horse so much. But yeah, with the endgame crisis, the way it works with Attila is every time you destroy one of the Huns' armies, they spawn back immediately in the like the Slavic area. So the way to stop that from happening is when you fight one of their armies, don't destroy it, because if you destroy it, they come back with a doom stack. But if you don't destroy it, they run off into the wilderness and just recruit mercenaries and low-tier units. So they actually end up taking longer before that army comes back, and they'll be like just trash units as opposed to a doom stack. So counterintuitive. And the way to defeat the endgame crisis is to only ever kill, as much as possible, only ever kill Attila. Go out, assassinate him, wound him in battle as many times as you can, depending on your difficulty setting. Once he's finally dead for good, then you can start wiping out their armies. Very counterintuitive, very stupid system, in my opinion. You have to, basically, if you're aware of it, gaming the system is really not that difficult. It's very, very stupid. Not a fan of that endgame crisis at all. Especially considering that when they burn down settlements take so long to recover. So it's just a really irritating system. Very punishing. Without any real reward. Because when you defeat Attila, the game is like, well, guess what? You don't have to deal with Attila anymore. It's like, fuck you, man. It's just not very interesting. Can't really think of any other Total War games that have endgame crisis. I'm sure there are, I'm just not really thinking them at the moment. I don't think Empire and Napoleon have them. But yeah, in Warhammer 1 and 2, there was the Chaos endgame crisis. I mean, in Warhammer 2, you could turn it off at least. Again, it had spam armies, but at least in Warhammer 2, with the second wave, all you had to do was ensure that Kolek, Sigvald, and Archaon were wounded at the same time, and all the other armies would just disappear. So that was. I'd actually go so far as to say that and Shogun 2 system probably the most interesting, but none of them are actually interesting. None of them. Shogun 2. Okay, I'll just say Shogun 2 is probably the most interesting out of them, but I still don't like it personally. I think I'll get more people saying it's great than not. But me personally, I don't like it. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Endgame Crisis with Total War Warhammer. I think that there's a lot that they can do to improve upon this system. Again, I don't think it's a critical issue. If they didn't change anything with the Endgame Crisis system and just added more Endgame Crises to it, I think that's perfectly fine. But it's not the best that they can be. It's like a C+ system, and I'd like it to be a B+ system at the minimum for me to basically turn it on in my personal campaigns. Like, I just turn it off. And it feels like, even though I don't put much time and effort into it, the fact that I turn it off is just wasted. It's kind of like the Realms of Chaos. It exists, I don't play it. Don't waste my time with it. So you got to give the player a reason for doing it, and the best way to do that is give multiple reasons. And some people, grind is good enough, but for others it's not. And for me, grind isn't good enough in this case here. But that's just me. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think of endgame crises in Total War Warhammer 3 specifically and in Total War in general, and some of the solutions that you might have to solving this to make it more interesting. Again, not a critical issue. This isn't something that needs to be fixed because it's not broken. It works as intended. It's just the way that it's intended is boring, in my opinion. How would you improve upon this system? And that's really the kind of stuff I want to be doing with these critiques, is thinking about systems that I think are lackluster and improving and trying to find some way to improve them, as opposed to going, this system is broken and shit and should be removed or something like that. I don't think that's very helpful at all. Anyway, that's the end of this one. I hope you guys have enjoyed this critique. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Once again, be respectful to one another. Don't just copy paste this fucking link in Reddit. Talk about the issue, leave me out of it, okay? And if you do that, I'll make another video, another critique. I've got to think of a topic though, and I won't need to do these long disclaimers, basically talking down to you guys, asking you to behave. Behave? I won't need to tell you off. Well, that's simple. Anyway, that's the end of this one. Appreciate you. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. Later, guys. Bye.